So today's program will focus on a chronological history of the area, beginning way back in 1600, kind of through the 1800s. So Bob Nelson here is our local Bayfield resident historian. He has a wealth of knowledge and has put together this fine piece to share with us today. He hails from a commercial fishing family, worked for the WDNR, the Wisconsin Conservation Corps, and is now retired, identifies as a lifelong Rocky Islander, and he has published many local regional history books, including Memories and Minutes, Apostle Islanders, The People and Culture, Harbor City Chronicles, among others, and we have all of his books out here if you want to take a peek. So without further ado, I will invite up Bob and let him carry on.
Well, it's pretty hard to follow a person like Megan because she's one of the best in the business. The histories that I bring forward today, you could probably go to universities all over the nation and make a study of each period in time, each event that happened here. I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to kind of give you snapshots in time. I want you to be able to take a peek and say, oh, that happened, oh, this happened, oh, that happened. And I got some nice photos that hopefully will complement it. I hope if I put my glasses on that you won't be annoyed by the up and down on it, because I need to be able to do that a little bit. This whole process started way back in 2016, where a pile of Bayfield people thought, this is could be a celebration for our 160th year of being Bayfield, Wisconsin at that point in time. So I got in the mood there, and I threw together about, again, 3,000 photos, actually about 62, and started from there. And all of a sudden, that idea kind of went away a little bit. And then time passed, and I was asked to do a presentation on history of this area here this year. And so I took some of those notes, and I said, there's so much history in Bayfield, Wisconsin, unbelievable. From when the French were here to when the native people were on the shores. And I said, got to cover a little bit of it, quite a bit of it, as much as I can of it in a period of time. So what I said I'm going to do is I'll do this shorty here, which is about 42 slides. And then hopefully next summer, if I don't do bad today, I'll get invited back next spring. And maybe I'll do the second portion, which will probably cover from 1856 to probably in the 1870s. And at that point in time, I'll tell you more about the people, places, epic events, boats, sinking of boats, industries, and that type of thing. So in this first period of time, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit out of my realm of expertise, but I'll give it a whirl. I have all my resources are identified in the last slide here, but I want to give a lot of credit to Howard Papp. Anything that goes native on here is from his resource book, Red Cliff, Wisconsin. And I stole some ideas from Guy Burnham, who was the editor of the Ashland Daily Press. And I stole a few ideas from Hamilton Nelson Ross, who wrote the book of LaPointe Village Outpost. And then I refer a little bit in here to my dear friend, old Eleanor Knight. She knew the peoples. She didn't know the peoples, but she wrote the stories of the peoples, in which when we get into the Shakers and Movers section here, that's my resource. I started off this presentation with a quick question. In the hallowed halls of Congress, there is a bust of a person familiar to this area that served the area a long time ago. I want to just tease your mind a little bit and see if you can think about it a little bit. And in the second slide I'll show you this honorable person. And I'm pretty sure there's some people know who that could be here, but I'll leave that to your imagination and we'll come back to you. Now I want to start into this condensed version of Americana with a little perspective of the First Nation people. Again, it's short. From the Lac de Flambeau people museum archives, it stated that right around 3000 BC to 1000 AD, that the first three nations of the ancient Anishinaabe peoples occurred here, and they were the Ojibwe, which they identified as the keepers of the faith. The Potawatomi were identified as the keepers of the fire, and the Ottawa were the traders. And they began to migrate westward from the St. Lawrence Seaway. A long time ago. They've been here a real long time. So from about 1395 to the late 1400s, from Howard Papp, I learned that this is an approximate timeline that the Ojibwe people reached Madeline Island, and I can't hardly say Manawanakani Island, which is the Chippewa name for that. It is believed that that migration took about 500 years to complete, at which time the Ojibwe people traveled as far west as northern Minnesota, and where food, wild rice, grew and was prophesied by their elders. And that's one of the reasons I think they were prophesied to come and see some of that great food that was here. About 1545, the Ojibwe people began to move off of Madeline Island and spread inland. Howard Papp further mentions that the Chippewa did not return to the Chequamegon to stay until sometime after 1679, when a person by the name of Daniel Graysolon negotiated a treaty between the French and the Ojibwe and the Dakota. Aha! The great person to which I speak is the great Chief Buffalo. His bust presently is in the Hall of Congress, remains there. Chief Buffalo, also known as, here we go, Kichiwishki, was the chief of all Indian tribes east of the Mississippi River. And he signed the Treaty of 1854, which kept the Native Ojibwe people from being extirpated by the federal government to Minnesota. Homeland reservations were created, and federally legislated rights to hunt, fish, and gather were created. In 1852, Chief Buffalo, along with his adopted son, Benjamin Armstrong, left this area from Madeline, canoed all the way down along the shoreline of Lake Superior, down to Detroit, and then they took the train into Washington, and there is where Buffalo met the President of the United States and came up with this plan to keep basically the Ojibwe people from taking on a warlike position. Not only was Buffalo a politician, which he's a master at in those days, you just don't get in to see a president even those days. He was a master politician, he was also a warrior. He had, this is one skirmish I want to tell you a little bit about, and it was met at the Brule River, where the Lakota or Dakota were feeling that the tribes up in this area were at a weaker point in their ability to fight one another, that they met, they were advancing as far as the Brule River, and Great Holland the day was a Chippewa leader down in the southern part of the state, and he contacted Buffalo up here and said, we got to do something about this. So Buffalo assembled his tribal people, of which they were far less in numbers than the Lakota had, and said they headed to the Brule. What happened there was he was far outnumbered, but his tactic was to position men on the west side, on the banks, and behind them. And at that point in time, the Lakota came across the river. He sent down some warriors, and they chased those warriors back up the banks of the Brule. At that point in time, Buffalo's people were able to circumvent them and come up from the rear, and the slaughter was great at the expense of the Sioux people. The Dakota lost, according to the numbers that I've read, 101 men. The Ojibwe lost 13 people, and the battle was recorded as such by Benjamin Armstrong on the banks of that great river in, what's the date here? 1842 was the date, okay? Chief Buffalo, one of the great men in America, okay? Oh boy, here we go. A lot of people don't realize it, but many flags flew over this area, or some were not planted, but they were under the supervision of countries. So from Armstrong, or from the Ashland Daily Press, I learned that the European claim to ownership of the Chequamegon Bay area flew under the flag of Spain for nearly 270 years prior. When Ponce de Leon landed on the Sandpoint there in Florida, he stuck the flag, and I don't think they had a governing body in any community, but they claimed this for Spain. France took over a little bit later, and they were here from 1627 to 1762. They were here on these shores for 135 years. The flag of Great Britain flew here from 1736 to 1783. On July 4th, the United States of America put together, and the Declaration of Independence was signed. However, it wasn't until 1781 that the Articles of the Confederation were ratified, and the Constitution itself was ratified in 1788. Congress first met in 1789, and George Washington was inaugurated the President of the United States. The Bill of Rights were signed in 1791. Washington, D.C. became the capital of the United States, and forever, the great Union, the great United States, the Republic, Democratic Republic, still reigns. And as you can see, it's not always one big happy body, but it is the supreme law of the land. Okay? Talk a little bit about Merci beaucoup, Mademoiselle, parlez-vous français? Here's the France. The France dominated this area again from 1627 to 1762. And they were spearheaded, they were here for the furs. That's really the name of the game. Historic dates that surround that were in 1608, a guy by the name of Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec and gradually moved westward to the falls of St. Mary's, the Sault Ste. Marie. In 1618, there was a gentleman, I don't know if he's a gentleman or not, but he was a voyager, a French explorer named Etienne Brou, which in France means Stephen, I guess. He is said to have encountered the Ojibwe in the Lake Superior area. He was the first European explorer to journey beyond the St. Lawrence River in what is today Canada, and taking on the lifestyle of the First Nation peoples, particularly Huron, Brou became an interpreter and a guide for Samuel de Champlain, who later sent Brou on a number of expeditionary missions, and it is said that at that point in time he moved by canoe and the people associated with him into this area. I think you know that in 1620 the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, but the French explorers at that time had already reached the falls of the St. Mary's, and this is where Lake Superior meets Lake Huron, and where the Ojibwe called this their home for many, many years, and they were known as the Saulteaux, or the people of the falls. So here we go, we got some photos. Yes, some photos there. As you can see, Le Sueur the only photo I could find of Menard. So anyway, we have Lesueur, Father Menard, Father Marquette, and Radisson, late 1600s. And this is a nice photo of a postcard that I have that showed where the state of Wisconsin at least believed that the first house in North America was. Very, very influential people in North America. They were the people that brought their ideology, some of it good, some of it not so good for Native peoples, some of it good for other peoples. Whatever was, whatever is. So in 1671, Father Menard arrived at Chequamegon Bay, and by 1662, the first building by a white man appeared anywhere in Wisconsin was established near Fish Creek over in Ashland, where the moccasin trails and the canoe trails converged from the north, east, south, and west. Everything met there. More than 50 villages could be encountered on the Chequamegon Bay in that area. And in 1662, the first Jesuit mission at Chequamegon was commenced by Father Henri Morey. And some more tidbits in time. In October of 1665, a priest from the Catholic faith arrived at Chequamegon and found living here 7 different nations of Indians. In 1665, they recorded this. There were the Huron, there were 3 branches of the Ottawa, the Osaki, or the Sioux, Sauk, the Outagamie, or Fox, and the Illinois tribes were here. I'm guessing that the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe people were also here, however, that was not put into this print. In 1669, Father Marquette visited Father Eloise at his chapel and left in 1870 to build a mission near Green Bay. In 1693, French Count Frontenac thereupon sent Pierre Charles de Lesueur to command at Chequamegon and keep open a route from Lake Superior to the Mississippi. Here, Lesueur built a stockade fort at LaPointe in 1693 on Madeline Island in Chequamegon Bay. In 1718, the French built a fort on St. Michael. They called Madeline St. Michael in those days on that island. And in 1727, it was known as the island of St. Michael. During this time period, there came the name, the Apostle Islands first appeared on a map. Before that, this was Lake Tracy, and they had French names for those islands. In 1736, in the time of Laurent, the Chippewa Nation obtained a footing on the west end of Lake Superior and drove the Sioux back to the plains. They had major battles going on those days, and they moved them all backwards, and they retained that spot. So, once again, you can see the people that were significant. Radisson was here, and Radisson Grouchier. And this is the spot, State of Wisconsin Historical Society felt where that first building was built. God save the Queen, right? A very important person that came into the picture here in the Bayfield area was a guy by the name of Alexander Henry. He was one of the leading pioneers of the British-Canadian fur trade, and he's following the British conquest of the New France. So they went through the war, and I didn't want to get into that too much, but they went through a war, and of course you all know that the British won, and he was a part of that, and he was a partner in the Northwest Company, a fur trading company, a fur company, and he was a member of the vice chairman of the Beaver Club. Anybody know what the Beaver Club is? That was a great, large group of investors in Europe that were heavily invested in the fur trade here, and he was a part of that group. So his ties to this area were basically A lot of it was to find beaver, that type of thing. Muskrat and mink and whatever would sell in Europe. He landed at what is now Bayfield and built a house just below Chapman's in their company store, which would be about where the Bayfield Maritime Museum is now. And there he called this place Chequamegon and said that he found 50 lodges of Native American people living on this shoreline. This was in 1765. In 1765, following the French and Indian War, Henry visited the region and found large masses of copper. There was a well-known, people needed copper in those days, and they found large masses of copper over in the Ontonagon area. The next year, he again visited the Ontonagon area, and the Indians showed him a solid mass of pure copper weighing an estimated 5 tons. During the winter of 1771 and 72, he organized a party of English miners, and they came to the Ontonagon River and explored for copper in that country. In 1763, Alexander Henry wrote firsthand about copper in that area, and he described a 100-pound chunk he had cut off with his axe from a single mass of copper. In 1765, he and a man synonymous with this area, Jean-Baptiste Cadotte, founded a fur training post at Chequamegon Bay at LaPointe. Cadotte had a son named Michael Cadotte, and forever after, Michael was involved in the history of that island big time. He was one of the factors in the Northwest Fur Company, an American fur company later owned by John Jacob Astor. A little fun here. On December 15th of 1776-75, Alexander writes in his manual, he says, the bay here is completely frozen over. And then on April 20th of 1766, he wrote that the ice broke up and several canoes arrived filled with women and children, who reported that the men, head of their land, had all gone out to war with the Nottowese or the Sioux. And this came from the history of the Bayfield County from the History of Northern Wisconsin Western Historical Society in 1881. They documented that. By 1768, Grand Portage, Minnesota was founded, one of the early fur trading centers, that and LaPointe. 1775, guess what? American Revolution. 1783, we end the Revolutionary War, and the civil governance of the Chequamegon Bay Area was facilitated then through the Northwest Territory Act for 4 years, and with the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States government at that time acquiesced to Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Okay? Note that our area started out as the province of Quebec, and this map kind of shows you, I believe, the original 13 colonies were here. This was somehow designated an Indian reserve. The Spanish still owned this until the Louisiana Purchase and all those type of things happened, and we're up in this territory at that point in time. Make sense? Question. Who said, give me liberty or give me death? Anybody got an answer? Patrick Henry. He lived from, and he said, so anyway, this period of time in North America was not a whole heck of a great big deal to us up here. We were still fur trading and so forth, and the revolution was a huge thing in America, but not so much for up here. The revolution started May 10th, 1773, with a Boston Tea Party, where those angry Bostonians rebelled against the British for taxation without representation and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. July 4th, 1776, our Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was sent to the printer on July, and on July 8th, the Declaration of Independence is read first publicly. On September 17th, the Constitution is signed, and on June 21st, 1778, the Supreme Law of the land is adopted when New Hampshire ratified this document, okay? And that's when we came to be. So another little shot, this is kind of fun. This is Jeffersons Plan, since we all became a nation now. This was he figured the United States should look like this. Up here is where he figured this part of the Wisconsin would be called Sylvania. Michigania, and all kinds of crazy names here, like Saratoga and Illinois and Washington and Mississippi and whatever those names are. So that was his layout of the land when Jefferson really thought about how this country should look at that period in time. So we move along very well. We're under all kinds of different governances until that point in time, until May 29th, 1848, when we become the 30th state in the nation to become a part of the Great Union. In 1836, the territory of Wisconsin was organized, and Henry Dodge was appointed governor of the territory. In 1848, the second Constitution of Wisconsin was adopted by popular vote on March 13th. Wisconsin was then admitted as the 30th state to the Union under an act of Congress approved on May 29th. Who was our first governor? Nelson Dewey. Good name. I like that name, Nelson. Okay. So if you look at this a little bit, I want to back up a little bit. The early Wisconsin counties at this point in time of 1850, after 1848, we're now LaPoint County. I had to put my glasses on here now. We're part of LaPoint County in 1854 and 1845 to 1860. And at that period in time, LaPointe was the center of governance over there, but it was shifted over to the township of Bayfield in the town of LaPointe. We never became a part of Bayfield County until 1866, when Bayfield County was set off from the rest of the counties. So you'll see at that time, there's LaPointe, St. Croix County, Chippewa County, Brown County, Marathon, Winnebago. Southern counties were all just one big thing there in Crawford. So from 1845 to 1860, Bayfield was under the governance of a place at LaPointe and run through that organization. I want to move now into the importance of this wonderful area. This is a painting of LaPointe, circa, it represents 1842, and a Wisconsin Historical Society image, 42457. Fortunately, we got very nice to have a photo like this available for us now. Kind of gives you the layout. The churches, the people that lived along here, American Fur Company. I'm pretty sure that right down in this area right in here is where American Fur Company was. We'll show you that in a minute. Indian burial grounds. City dock would be down in this area. So I just want to show you the inside of one of the first Catholic mission churches. This is Mission Church on the hillside. Here's the old Indian burial ground. This is the inside of this church right here. This is the LaPointe Catholic Church in 1870. It was moved from that hillside in 1870 down to the city where it's at right now. One more slide. You can see American Fur Company. This is the old mission site. This is taken right around 1900. You can see the dock is dilapidated, but they were here from about 1818 until they moved out of here, they actually fell apart. The organization fell apart a little bit later. And this is the first Protestant church that was located along the waterfront down at LaPointe. So I got a few tidbits in history here. So in 1818, John Jacob Astor made LaPointe the headquarters for Northwest Trade of the American Fur Company. And later on, he sold American Fur Company to Ramsey Crooks in 1833. By 1826, the present community of LaPointe, which you know now, was located at a middle fort site in the middle of that island, the waterfront, and it was constructed. A large fort, warehouses, living accommodations, and a long dock is built. The Truman and Lyman family brought a teacher here to that community in that year of about 600 people. 600 people lived at LaPointe, and I believe that fort is still represented by the Wisconsin Historical Society as the fort where they have their museum. 4 years later, in 1834, Father Barriga founded the first Catholic mission at LaPointe, founded a mission, and constructed the old mission church. By 1835, the population of LaPointe reaches a high water mark of 2,500 people. They call them souls in the article, traders, voyagers, and First Nation peoples. There were about 2,500 people living at LaPointe in those old days. By 1835, American fur trade was going into a slump, and they had some problems selling all their merchandise in Europe, so they went into the commercial fishing business. So now they were still trappers, that type of thing, but they were also started to invest their time and peoples into fishing in the islands. And at that point in time, Ramsey Crooks sent out an exploration team to the islands to see if fish could be caught. And Jane Bush, who a PhD, she'd written a book for the National Park Service, felt that the islands were Flatline Island number 1 and number 2. And in my opinion, that would have been at the standpoint of Rocky Island and across the way over at South Twin. So they had a long building there, and they had 2 or 3 cabins. They were a major operation. The old steamers in those days would actually come to the islands and pick up the fish, deliver the salt, and then move everything back to Bayfield and into Bayfield and down the Sault Ste. Marie and into places like Detroit and Chicago. In 1838, Father Barriga built the second Catholic church. Some people think of boats a church, but but anyway, that would be that one there, okay? And by 1842, the wealth that John Jacob Astor had, I think he slipped some money into another account, but by 1842, American Fur Company was bankrupt. They were done. They were in the hands of the receiver. And by 1845, LaPointe County included in its area the present counties of Ashland, Bayfield, and then Douglas was set off from St. Croix County jurisdictions, whereby our village of LaPointe became the governmental center. Aha! First steamer arrived at LaPointe, 1845. I'm going to do a little background on the Sioux Locks in a little bit, but it was monumental to get these big steamers in this big lake up the St. Mary's River and over the hills and over the falls there. We'll get into that a little bit. This is the first steamer. It was named the Independence, arrived to LaPointe, and this is from Hamilton Nelson Ross. It was a 105-foot propeller was brought here that year. It was the first steamer, he says, of any kind to sail that body of water. The Independence had been built 2 years earlier at Chicago, and like several other vessels, it was hauled around the falls of St. Mary's, on rollers and launched into Lake Superior many years before the Sioux locks were built in 1855. I had to throw that little photo in there, set the mood in a different direction. This is a painting my mother did of Rocky Island in 1956. It reflects on peace and serenity. And I'm going to reflect a little bit on the early days of Bayfield, which were not always so peaceful and serene, but kind of a fun thing. A little section on Bayfield shakers and movers. Bayfield wouldn't be where it is right now without shakers and movers. They had some wonderful, glorious people who set the pace and made the moves in the early days so that this community would be here presently. Among them was a gentleman by the name of Admiral Henri Woolsey Bayfield. I think a lot of people know a little bit about him, but he was born in Yorkshire, England. He surveyed this area from 1823 to 25. He mapped the bottoms so that, I'm pretty sure he did it for the Queen, so that, if they were fighting these wars over here, they would come in Chequamegon Bay and not get grounded, type of thing. And I think you all know that this community is named in his honor. The ship that he sailed on, this is a facsimile of it, right here, would have been something like that. The ship he was on was the Recovery. It was built in 1823. The official numbers just stated British. Built at Fort William, Ontario. The hull materials were wood. It had one deck. The builder's name was the Northwest Company. It was a fur company. The original owner was the Northwest Company in Fort William, Ontario, now Thunder Bay. Had a tonnage, old-style tonnage of 133. The history of it was, in 1823, it was used by Lieutenant Henri Bayfield in the survey of Lake Superior for the British Admiralty. 1828, it was run down the rapids at Sault Ste. Marie and sold to Mervyn Giddings and Company in Ohio for $500. It was reported to be sunk off of Fort Erie, Ontario, Lake Erie, right now. Next, this little shaker and mover at this point in time is about John C. Hanley. He came here on the Algonquin, May 8th, 1856. He came from Superior to Bayfield, and he was to meet up with Robinson Durley Pike, Julius Austrian, and at that point in time, he was the bucko that helped to lay out the streets and alleys in Bayfield. Plus, in 1859, he's the man that cut the road to Redcliffe, 13 feet wide, 13 feet on either side, for $79. A little bit later after that date, talk about work for nothing. But I suppose in those days that was quite a bit of money. Anyway, he brought his family here and they came a little bit later. The Algonquin is a wonderfully interesting boat. I love boats. I'm part of the Bayfield Maritime Museum and we're into this stuff big time and you just can't help it. Once it gets into your blood, it's there. The Cleveland Herald reported on November 20th, 1839 that the Algonquin was a new schooner of 60 tons. She was purchased and fitted up expressly for an expedition that sailed from this port, Cleveland, to Sault Ste. Marie last week. The company intended to take their vessel overland on the Canada side of the Sault Ste. Marie this fall, launch it into a river above, and be ready for operations in the following spring. They will have to raise the schooner from the water below the Sioux, place it on ways, and slide it something more than a mile through the city of Sault Ste. Marie before launching it on the upper shores. Captain John Daniel Angus, right here. John C. Hanley. Captain Angus said this in the Weekly Press of April 22nd, 1893. He said, "I note, yes, I have been on the lakes a great many years," said the old gentleman. "I have commanded the Brewster, the Astor, and the Siskoet, and I opened on the Algonquin and sailed it." Again, this was in an interview with Captain Angus back in 1893, and he was an old man by then. Another shaker and mover, obviously, here was the Tate family, Andrew, Nellie, and Lillian. Andrew Tate was one of Bayfield's key persons of interest. He was a druggist, he was a lawyer, he was a doctor, he was a county school board superintendent, and he arrived in 1857. He was also a county judge, district attorney, county treasurer, member of the town board, and president of a then water company. He owned the first American flag to fly in Bayfield, presently entrusted here, which we have, entrusted to the Bayfield Heritage Association. I learned this information from my old friend, Eleanor Knight. Another old family, the name's still synonymous in the area, is the Nurse family. Joseph Harvey Nurse was born in Washington, D.C. in 1830. He married Isabel Rittenhouse in 1853. She was the daughter of Benjamin Rittenhouse, who was one of the early investors in Bayfield. I could go on a week about those investors, but I'll just leave it at that. But her father was a general in the Civil War, and I think basically they got married, and the old guy said, I know a place in northern Wisconsin where you get a life, and to Bayfield they came. He was the receiver of the first U.S. land office in the area. He was a bookkeeper for Samuel S. Vaughn of the Vaughn family in Ashland, that type of thing. He was a school teacher and a proprietor of dry goods, shoes, clothing, and provisions. And he had a little store that would be just north of where the first bank in Bayfield was, the National Bank. I forget who's in that building now. It's a clothing store, but his little store was on that corner there, and there's where he sold everything. I got a fun little story that goes with this. So what type of guy was Joseph Nurse? The only way we'll know is if somebody tells us a little bit about their personality. So the Reverend McKee, who was one of the first Presbyterian ministers in Bayfield, they belonged to a lyceum, in which it was just an organization similar to where everybody gathered and you could say what you need to say there. And when it was organized at Vaughn's Store, which is where the Bell Building is in Bayfield right now, on the corner of Second North 2nd Street in Bayfield, on the corner there. It was a social club of the town, and pleasant memories of those meetings lasted long after Mr. McKee had left Bayfield. 45 years after one of the meetings, McKee recalled one of the humorous happenings and wrote, I remember a remark in our address in the Lyceum by the late Mr. Joseph Harvey Nurse. Nurse said, before I came to Bayfield, I had been taking cod liver oil and whiskey under medical advice for weakness of the lungs. I brought some with me, but under the invigorating atmosphere here in Bayfield, I had no need to use them medicinally. I used the oil to grease my boots and the whiskey for camphor. So, he became a healthy man, said McKee. Okay, another interesting family is the Shaker and Mover family, is the Patan family, that came here in 1871. But the gentleman that you see right here, Ed Patan, I believe, I saw his obituary in one of the newspapers in the basement here of the Bayfield Heritage Association in 1906, where he just passed away. And he said that he basically, it came out to be that he arrived in this area in about 1842, working for American Fur Company. He was born in 1816 or 1820 and probably told, get out of the house, go get a job up on the Lake Superior there. American Fur is looking for people. He came up this way, and that's about the time that American Fur was in the fish trading business, fishing business. I think he got hooked on it a little bit. Then he leaves, goes back to Lake Michigan, that area, and says to his brothers Nelson and Frank, I got an idea. Why don't we buy a boat? There was a boat for sale called the John B. Floyd, which is a revenue cutter. And up the shoreline they came with all their families, 142 pond nets and 6,000, 10,000 feet of gill nets. And they arrived here in 1871. But I believe that Ed Patan was the catalyst behind the whole family coming here at one point in time. And that name Patan is still synonymous with this area and in the city of Bayfield and town of Bayfield. Another gentleman, one of the great people of this community, he was in 1906 named the outstanding citizen of the Bayfield's first century. His name was Captain Robinson Durling Pike. He's an interesting story, and it's really a long story about him, but I'll just say this. Pike said, I remember well being in the office at LaPointe with Father, Elisha Pike. I was then a mere lad of 17, and I recollect hearing them discuss with Mr. Julius Austrian the question of running the streets in Bayfield north and south, and the avenues east and west, or whether they should run diagonally due to the topography of the country. But he decided on the plan as the town is laid out now. So that's how these roads came to be. If you ever grumble about the hills and all these things around here, these are the guys that laid the footwork for that. Captain Pike was born in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and came to LaPointe with his parents in 1855, and he was 17 years old then. Along with the building of a waterfront sawmill, Captain Pike assigned the name locally as he fought in the Civil War. He helped to entertain the State Fish Commission when they came to inspect the site in 1895. He immediately donated between 200 and 300 acres of his valuable meadowland at Pikes Bay, including part of Pikes Creek. Colonel Wing and William Knight donated land adjoining it, and some land was purchased from Wright and Ketchum. They were loggers in the area, C.P. Rudd, and the Moore Estate. He planned the road as it runs today to Bayfield and worked hard to see it completed. He became Bayfield's first commuter, building his fine home at Salmo, right on Pikes Creek there, that beautiful home, sandstone home on the right now, and driving back and forth to his office in Bayfield with a pair of horses named Prince and Jesse. That's Captain Pike and his sawmill. I think probably many of you have seen that photo of the mill. But it says here in 1890 that Captain Pike's sawmill, the Little Daisy, was a mill that set records that year. He has sawed 8 miles of shingles this season. The timber cut that year at Vaughn's Mill was 800,000 feet of lumber, 600,000 shingles. R.D. Pike cut 300,000 feet of lumber, 1 million shingles. In the Elijah Pike Mill out in Pikes Creek area did 150,000 feet. That's the October 20th, 1880 Bayfield Press. Okie doke. Another of Bayfield's greatest, some would say his greatest, some would say he had a pretty good plan that worked, was Henri Morey. In his early days, he was a land speculator, organizer, and developer of the Bayfield Land Company, which organized this piece of property, the 350 acres which we now sit on. He was a former Minnesota territorial delegate to the 38th and 34th Congresses of 1853 through 1857, and Minnesota senator from 1858 to 1863. Rice, in 1847, was a federal Indian commissioner, and he was sent to Chequamegon to move the Chippewa, to try to talk the Chippewa into moving to the west of the Mississippi. That came from a booklet called Dalrymple's Dream. He was instrumental in negotiating the United States Treaty with the Ojibwe Chippewa Indians in 1847. Died in 1894. The Bayfield Township Company was organized by him of St. Paul and the head of some very enterprising men from Washington, D.C. Major McAvoy arrived here right about that time, 1st of March in 1856, and made his headquarters with Julius Austrian at LaPointe. Austrian in those days being the governor general of all that part of the country west of Ontonagon to Superior, Ashland, Duluth, etc. So he came here, he organized the being of this community, and you know what they had in their sights. They wanted the timber on the hillsides, and the first thing that come here, I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. This guy is the guy I think was a huge, huge player in Bayfield. He was born in July 1st, 1852. He was the editor of the Bayfield County Press for over 25 years, and he died in 1921. He was receiver of the land office for many years here. He was a town chairman for 11 years and county board member for 9 and member of the State Fish Commission. To him was almost all credit due the establishment of the Bayfield Fish Hatchery. A little side story there is that he's the guy that went to Pike and says, hey, we got a chance to put in a really nice fish hatchery up here. There's only one more in the state in Madison. Let's get this thing rolling. Just so happened that Bell was appointed to the Fishery Commission at that time. And he said, well, let's get on it. So down to Madison he goes. And after they started this whole process, I think in about 1893, and they had a wine and dine, you know how it all goes. They brought these people up. They went to all these other sites in the state of Wisconsin. Finally, that commission said, we're going to appropriate money so that you build a beautiful hatchery here in Bayfield for the purpose of propagating not only lake trout, but they also propagated whitefish, they propagated black bass, they propagated whatever needed to be propagated in that hatchery. This I learned from Eleanor Knight. So, as you can see right here, this beautiful hatchery, that's about what it looked like when it's completed. And here's the Bell Building, which was, this is a 1906 photo of it, but you can see where it had the end addition on, here. What's left here, these two here, and this whole addition. So it was, that building was quite larger, and in 1949, they knocked that stuff out of there, and I think I learned from Dan that the Bayfield Press components are still underneath the show house in Bayfield, or the Brownstone building, and they built a theater for us kids, which we used to go there for 2 bits a piece. So I want to tell you a little story. Tragic now that Lieutenant Governor Fifield's home in Ashland was razed this January. Just a little plug here to say that whenever you get a chance in the community to save historic structures, take a whack at it, because now Fifield's home is gone on Vaughan Avenue. And then we learned from, thanks to Myrtle Judd Nurse, we have an account of Curry Bell's arrival here in the frontier Chequamegon country. Myrtle Judd Nurse writes, when Curry Bell first came to the North Woods, he landed in Ashland. It had been a raining, wet day, and on 2nd Street, a mere trail, wagons were stuck to the hubs in the red clay. Mr. Bell went down to the waterfront and sat on a log where he debated whether to return home to Waterloo, Wisconsin, where he had established and edited their journal, or to go on over to Bayfield. He was feeling pretty darn blue, and as he let one hand drop down to the ground, something cold touched it. On the collar was the inscription of an upturned face of a dog with a collar. It said, I am Sam Fifield's dog. "Whose dog are you?" Bell began to laugh and went over to Bayfield, where he remained the rest of his life. So that's the real story of why Curry Bell came to Bayfield. Those are, in a nutshell, there are a lot of contributors to this community, and I'm going to touch on more the next time I come around here, but I just thought I'd introduce you to that five. The transportation to the area, let's go to the St. Croix Trail. Yeah, the Bayfield St. Croix Trail. How the heck you get to Bayfield in the old days? It was by canoe, by foot. There were Native American trails that went from the east to the Bad River area, from the south, from Lac du Flambeau, from the west to the western tribes there, Fond du Lac, and nothing from the north other than the Chippewa tribes that would take their canoes across from Grants Point over to Long Island Point, Point Chequamegon. A little later, I find out that there's a trail north here, which is tremendously interesting to me. It started at the waterfront of Bayfield, and it wound up down around Taylor's Falls and into Pig's Eye Island. And that was the Bayfield St. Croix Trail. As you can see it, coming down from Bayfield. This is a map from 1877, which I got. Comes down through here, goes right around Washburn. There's not much going on in Washburn over here at the time. There's a little route that goes into Washburn, and then it follows this route here down through Creeks Meadows, southern end of Bayfield County, through the Barrens. And then if I had a map of Burnett County here, I could show you that it goes down along the St. Croix River and down to St. Croix Falls. And there it stopped for a while, and there it was in 1869 that Bill Chapman from Bayfield picked up one of Bayfield's truly great people, William Knight, which I will showcase in the next round. They brought him back December 29th to Bayfield, and he lived here and he was a part of the Shakers and Movers of Bayfield in that period in time. Okay. And I want to tell you a little bit about the importance of the Locks of St. Mary's. This place probably would have been delayed by another 50 years if it hadn't been for the United States government, Canadian people, putting the locks in down there. In 1852, Congress authorized the construction of a canal and lock system at Sault Ste. Marie. Ships now would be able to pass the falls from Lake Superior into the St. Mary's River without unloading their cargo. This came from Dalrymple's Dream, Chapter 1. The completion of the locks in 1855 connected Bayfield to cities like Buffalo and Tonawanda, New York in the east, Detroit on Lake Huron, and Chicago in Lake Michigan. Now we could begin to harvest the timberlands and the brownstone from this area and send them to great cities like Chicago, which also sent our timber out to great cities like St. Louis, Missouri, and New York and other places. So what this did was it allowed for the trade from Bayfield to the broader country, again, with lumber, and I should mention fish and brownstone, etc. I learned from Hamilton Nelson Ross that the Native American name for Bayfield, he said, was Odina Ashki. So we were founded March 24th, 1856. This is an old photo that I gleaned out of the Bayfield archives down here. Kind of shows you where really isn't much going on here. There were a lot of shipping, a lot of commerce going on. LaPointe is over here. Bayfield is here. Whose house that is, I don't know. Bill Chapman's building is not here yet at this point in time. And this would probably be First Street right here. This would probably be Second Street, and this would be Many Penny coming up, maybe up the hill here. So that's a real old photo of Bayfield, and I did what I could with it to make it look presentable for you today. So we were founded in March 1856, and the records that we have were lost in fires. And so the first records of this community are lost until April 5th, 1859. And at that point in time, if you want to see beautiful penmanship, you ought to see the penmanship of Joseph Harvey Nurse, because they did all the notes in the community. And we have them downstairs here. So this building here is very, very important to retaining the history of this area. I'm heading towards a wrap-up now. Of course, everybody knows the word manifest destiny. It was kind of the belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable. And Bayfielders took advantage of the pineries, the fishery, and later on the brownstoning and whatever needed to be done in this area. From early Bayfield pioneer Andrew Tate, speaking about the early settlement in Bayfield, in a short note speech he presented at a celebration of the United States between 1873 and 1880, he says, "Here, the first steamer, sidewheeler, that arrived at Bayfield was the Lady Elgin, which occurred on the 16th day of June, 1856, on which boat arrived the engineer, John T. Cahill, carpenters, and others for the purpose of building a sawmill in Bayfield." The beginning of the timberland cut up here, which wound up agriculture in a few years afterwards. I want to leave it there and leave you at this point in time where Bayfield is now here. We're starting to cut the hillsides. We're starting to fish commercially heavily. And in Sector 2 of what I hope to do next year, if I don't get pie thrown at me before I leave today here, we're talking too long, I will take you from probably 1854 until about 1880, and you'll hear the great sea disasters, shipwrecks, ships. You'll meet more people. You'll see more situations arise, and we'll move from there later on from 1881 until about 1920, where you see some real action going on in town. So with that in mind, on behalf of the Bayfield Heritage Association and Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy, I thank you, and I hope you'll have a chance to get a few little things to nibble on here. And at the end of the day, go Packers.